Chapter 2, Part 1, Moral Relativism. The objectives for this chapter begin by encouraging you to consider some of the consequences of ethical relativism. Then, you'll have the opportunity to try to respond to some of these consequences. We're going to begin with a story about Dave and Alison. "No, madame, may not drive this way," explained the officer, who with the nicest smile had just waved them to a stop. Alison looked at her husband Dave, sitting beside her in the car, who just shrugged. They had recently arrived in this town for the next big leg of their tour of the world's more exotic spots. "But you just let another car go by you a minute before," Alison said, turning back to the policeman. "Don't much speak English," the policeman said, "but cannot drive this road." Dave and Alison stared at the man, who was smiling still more broadly than before. "I cannot let drive. I sometimes only let officials." Dave continued staring for a moment, and suddenly gave Alison a knowing look. Pulling out his passport, he placed a 5-pound note on top. "Oh, then it's okay," he said to the officer. "We are visiting officials. Here, see my papers." Reaching in front of Alison and over the window, he carelessly dropped the money out the window while holding open his passport. The policeman swiftly caught the fluttering money, pocketed it, and glanced for a moment at the passport. Then, still smiling, he stepped back and waved. "Good, madame. You are official. You have right this way," he said, not giving them a further glance. Alison drove a mile and then shot a curious look to her husband. "When in Rome, do as the Romans do," he said, forcing a little laugh. "And just how much do you think we should act like the Romans anyhow?" Alison retorted. "Live and let live," Dave muttered. "Let's just forget about it." "But I don't like that sort of thing, and I hate to waste money," Alison said, more heatedly than she intended. As an afterthought, she added, "You know, Dave, men in this culture may have several wives. I wouldn't be surprised if that policeman had a couple. And I didn't care for the way he looked at me. I hope you won't tell me that polygamy's okay, too." Trying to laugh it off, Dave commented, "Well, my dear, it has its attractions." "That," Alison spat out as she floored the accelerator, "is not funny." Okay, so what's going on in this story? I'm going to go through a quick summary, just in case you missed a couple of parts. Unfortunately, this does mean that I'm going to spoil the joke at the end, but such is life. So the story begins with Dave and Alison vacationing in some far-off place, and we need to assume that the culture is very different than their own culture. Their car was stopped by an officer who wouldn't let them pass down the road they were trying to drive on. And Dave realized that bribery is practiced in this culture, and so he bribed the officer with a 5-pound note, and we see that the officer let Dave and Alison pass. After they drove off, Alison expressed to Dave that she didn't think that it was okay to bribe the officer, because in the society where Alison and Dave come from, bribery's not okay. Dave responded by saying, "When in Rome," meaning that it's necessary to follow the customs of the society that you're in, not necessarily the one that you're from. And Alison responded to this by pointing out that it was a custom of the society that they were in to practice polygamy, which is the practice of having more than one wife. Dave couldn't possibly accept polygamy, so why should he accept bribery? Now, as I said, the story ends with a joke, which I'm going to spoil now. In response to Alison's point about the tension of accepting bribery, but maybe not wanting to accept polygamy, Dave said, "Well, my dear, polygamy has its attractions," right? Which Alison did not think is very funny. Okay. So, What this story is trying to draw out is a tension in the view that different societies can have different and independent moral systems. If we remember, this is one of the things that followed from the Ring of Gyges story. If we're willing to say that something like bribery is okay in a particular culture because it's accepted there, are we also willing to say the same thing about polygamy? And if we are willing to say that both polygamy and bribery are okay depending on the culture, is there anything that we wouldn't want to be okay? Okay, to review. What are some of the consequences of ethical relativism? And how might you respond to these consequences?